Hello everyone and welcome to today's session, Challenging Behaviours 2, a how-to on having that conversation. Our presenter is Nicole Nash-Arnold. Nicole is a nursing career coach who helps great nurses transform into respected leaders. She shares her 15 years of experience in both senior and executive health leadership roles to germinate great leadership. Clinically, Nicole has over 10 years perioperative experience before moving into her nurse educator and management roles. She has postgraduate qualifications in perioperative nursing and currently a Master's in Nursing. Nicole is a member of the International Coaches Federation. Nicole, welcome to the microphone.
Thank you very much, Sue. Welcome everybody. Today we're in our second of a series of webinars that I'm conducting on challenging behaviour. Last week we looked at what sorts of challenging behaviours and your role in that. And we unpacked those sorts of frustrations that we feel when there's challenging behaviours in our environment. And the problem with challenging behaviours is that it really impacts our workforce. It has a massive impact on morale. It has a massive impact on the way we feel when we turn up to work. And it has and is considerable impact in our absenteeism and our ability and willingness to stay in a workplace. Because when challenging behaviours start to take control of an environment and a culture, then it starts to make it a truly horrible place to work. And what we're after is a truly great place to work. One of my favourite quotes is, what you permit, you promote. And that's one of those situations where if you let it go through to the keeper, if you let behaviours just be ignored and you never really worry about it, then you promote that behaviour. Junior nurses and other staff in your environment are watching that, and they're watching where they put fences around certain behaviours. And so if you permit it, then what you're saying is that's fine and I promote that behaviour. I let that go and I think that's absolutely fine. And the behaviours that we talked about last week, which we will recap just in a minute, are the very behaviours that degrade our workplaces. What I want for you during these series of presentations is that you have a situation where you don't permit those behaviours and that you don't promote them. But it's often very difficult because we often go too hard, steamroll a situation, or we do nothing at all. So this is going to give you some structure and some frameworks and some scaffolding around how you're going to take on a very difficult conversation with some very difficult behaviours. So to recap, this is what we covered last week. We talked about some of the behaviours and some of the characters that we see. And I think in this series, it's important to recap on which behaviours that we're talking about. So we have got certain people like our very bossy individual who is the informal leader and uses his skills for good or evil. And that can be very, very impactful when they are the ones that always talk about what they think as if they're the only ones that count and that they're almost the owner of that department. Very bombastic and can be very frustrating. Then we've got the brutal. They're brutal with their feedback. They wanted honesty in the environment and they deliver that honesty with absolute brutality. They're often on the warpath and they savage people in their wake and they let rip when it's not something that they would do or that they wanted, and they're aggressive. Important to point out in this, as I did last time, we're talking about unwanted behaviours, not bullying and harassing behaviours. So on that spectrum, we're outside of what's bullying and harassment and just the frustrating and the inappropriate and the annoying. We've got the lazy, and every single department has one of these. They find the most extraordinary ways to disappear, never have the workload that everybody else, never on time with their work, always seem to cut corners. Miss busy, just And as I said last week, one of my most frustrating. They're busy nurses and they're busy through the ward and they're always too busy to take another patient or any other work, and they're always too busy to go to tea. When you're the team leader and you say, you're on first tea break, you need to go. I'm too busy, I've got to do this, this, this and that. And then 2 hours later they say, I'm ready now. Incredibly frustrating and impactful on the workforce. The kooky bizarre, the person that makes you feel a little bit unsettled about their behaviour and they're really, really unusual. The treacherous. Manager's worst nightmare, it's the town cynic. Hates everything about the place, every new idea, every new form, every new policy, every new change in process. Always terrible, but St. Elsewhere's, where they used to work, well, it was great there and it was excellent and we did it right, but this place, no, everything's terrible. The know-it-all. Clinically excellent and they feel like that's the only thing that counts. But their behaviour doesn't count, it just matters that they're clinically exceptional and everyone's got to cop how they behave and what they see in the world. Often we make excuses about these people. Oh, but they're great in an emergency. If it was my mother, I'd want them looking after me. But doesn't excuse the behaviour because the behaviour is often deplorable. Critical, the micromanager. These are the people that are always on the warpath about this is the way it should be done and critiquing everybody else's work. What you've done, and they're over the top of you. They're always looking over your shoulder, telling you what you should have done and have you done this and what about if you've forgotten that. And then there's the person who's just plain combative. No matter what you say to these people, they're always got to say black if you say white, or got an opinion on everything and they always want to share it. And they're always on edge, always very, very stressed. So for these people, they're often the challenging behaviours that we see that are most impactful. But what's important to remember is they're not the only ones. They're just the frequent flyers that I have seen in most of my clinical departments. And so as we put some scaffolding around how you're going to manage these conversations with our bad behaviours, then I've taken the one example out of this group, and that's lazy. I've chosen lazy for us to challenge their behaviour because almost every single department has one. And they're pretty easy to identify. So suddenly those people are suddenly disappearing the minute handover is over. They're very brazen about squirming out of work, always are in the tea room, find themselves with the lightest patient load, never quite doing their work and cutting corners. So it's the most frustrating when you're working with them because you end up picking up their slack and they never seem to say thank you. They never seem to even be aware of what is going on. So when we talked about that last week, they're the sorts of behaviours that we were talking about. And this was the second part that was important. What's the threshold? This is significant because we talk about when do we act. With lazy, when do we take on the challenging behaviour? And I have 2 rules for that. Does it affect team cohesion? Does it affect patient care? Now, laziness is a great example because it's obviously going to affect team cohesion because when they're lazy, everybody else has got to pick up the slack. The IV antibiotics that are due at 10 don't go away because they're too busy sitting in the tea room for a 30-minute morning tea. Someone's got to do it. And it's really frustrating. When their buzzers are going constantly in the ward and they're not answering them, someone's got to answer them. So it becomes very frustrating. Does it affect patient care? When you've got someone cutting corners and doing a sloppy job, it's most definitely affecting patient care. So almost always lazy will trigger both of those questions. And so it's reasonable for you to take action. But the question is how you do that. Now, in terms of elements, we talked about how last week about what you might have. You want to provide compassion and you want to have an edge of expectation. You want to make a request of them. You want to deliver them some respect and you want to follow up and make sure there's evidence of that. So they're the sorts of elements that you've got to have in your conversation. But in terms of actually having that conversation, how are you going to structure that? What's it going to look like and feel like? That's what we're going to go through today. There are a couple of models that will help you navigate this difficult conversation. Because if you just go in completely unprepared without a plan, then it's almost certainly going to fail. And it's a difficult conversation. We're excellent as clinicians about developing skills in our clinical arena, but outside that and the soft skills, then we often don't have much of an opportunity to do that. So we'll have a look at a couple of models for us to scaffold that conversation. So our first one is a model called Situation, Behaviour, Impact Feedback Tool. So this is how you're going to structure your conversation. So step one is looking at the situation. When you're giving feedback, you first must define where and when is the situations that you're referring to. It gives you some opportunity to be objective about this situation, because this is a challenging behaviour is something that is incredibly emotive. You will feel a lot of things: angry, disappointed, frustrated, lots of emotions. What is hard is to separate the emotions so that you can have a logical, sequenced conversation around that behaviour so that you can challenge it effectively. And what you want is change. You want that person to make a change. So you have to think very clearly about the where and the when of this situation. It puts the feedback into a context when you do that, and it gives the other person a very specific setting as a reference as well. So it's the first part of your conversation. When you sit down with them, then the first part of your content must be about the very specific situation. It cannot be a vague, I think you're lazy. It has to be something about a very specific situation. Every time I've ever given feedback to people, I find their natural disposition that they retreat to is one of defensiveness. So if I say to them, look, I really think you're quite lazy, then their immediate response, almost 100% of the time, is, what do you mean? Can you give me an example? And instantly that conversation is adversarial. I'm on one side of that conversation, they're on the other, and we're combating. And they will say, tell me who said that? If I say, look, I've had lots of feedback that you're lazy. People have told me. Or who? Can you tell me who? Well, it doesn't really count much if you can't even tell me who. And it gives them leverage to be able to completely extinguish the points about what you're saying. So take a very, very precise time when you're giving that feedback. If content of your conversation, if what you're going to say is the prince, then context is king. And it will stop them countering everything you're saying with who, what, where, when, which is information you're not going to be able to share. So, for example, this model its feedback tool relies heavily on the notion that you get this out of the way from the outset. And then you can move on to the what. And you've got open ears. So this phase is about setting the scene. What's important also in this, when you sit the conversation down, is that it's important to set the tone of the conversation as well. There's a great example in a research study about performance appraisals. When people have done performance appraisals, then usually when you sit down with your manager for your performance appraisal, you're not listening to what is being said, you're listening for the tone. And you're listening to find out, is this good news or is this bad news? Am I going to be told that I'm a good performer or a poor performer? So you're not listening to what your manager is saying, you're just listening to find out the context. Is this good or bad? And then when they say something definitive like, this was really excellent, you're performing really well, Nicole, then you relax back and you go, okay. And you need to go back to everything that your nurse manager has said, because you've missed it all, because you were just listening to, is this good, is this bad, is this good, is this bad? Equally, when someone says, so it's a really area of development, Nicole, this is a really significant problem for us in your performance, then you're like, okay, it's bad. So tell me about what it is again. I missed it all. The better way to start a performance appraisal is to say, when they walk in and say, Nicole, this is all good. There are a couple of areas where we can concentrate on, but this is going to be a good, positive performance appraisal. Or, Nicole, this is going to be an uncomfortable conversation. When you're setting the scene and delivering the part about the situation, it is crucial that you set that scene in terms of this is going to be an uncomfortable conversation. You've approached them and they'll be spent the time thinking, why has Nicole come to me? What's this about? This is weird that we're in this empty room away from the nurse's station. What's this about? When you set that scene, and I often use that exact term, and I would say, Angela, this is going to be an uncomfortable conversation, but I need to talk to you about a situation recently. So get that context out of the way from the outset, and then you've got people that are hanging on your every word to find out what you're talking about, not why you're talking about it. So now this is going to be crucial, and you set the scene in terms of the situation. Angela, this is going to be an uncomfortable conversation, but during yesterday morning's handover, when you gave handover about bed 12, and then we'll move on from there with the next phase. Or another example might be at the staff meeting on Monday afternoon. So you're setting the tone and you're setting the situation so that we can move on to what it is. But you are giving them a very specific situation for them to re-envisage in their mind so that they know the what about what we're talking about. The next stage is that you focus on the behaviours that you want addressed, that you find are unacceptable. Now this part's the hardest part. This is the meat. And this is the part you will be starting to feel a lot of stress because you've got someone that you've delivered that it's going to be an uncomfortable conversation. They're thinking about the situation. Most of the time people will know when you've set the scene about where you're going with this conversation. And they will start to feel that emotion, usually defensiveness, and usually maybe some anger, maybe lots of things, but they won't be, sometimes they'll be dismissive. Oh, are we really going to talk about Monday's staff meeting? This is ridiculous. There will be emotion at this point, which is what makes it hard. But it's essential that you focus on the behaviours that you observed directly. If you visualise yourself in the middle of a legal drama in this particular moment and the legal counsel on the other side say, objection, Your Honour, hearsay, is exactly what you want to stay away from in this conversation. It's a road to nowhere when you start with this conversation by saying, I heard on the grapevine, or someone said to me that, or I've had a lot of feedback from the other staff members. It makes it easier for you because then you don't have to own the feedback because it's for everybody else's. But actually, it's just hearsay. And you have to be able to talk in tangibles. And they will easily say, who said what, when? And you'll be back and forthing about the who, what and when of the situation and not the behaviour. So there's nothing to be gained by dealing in hearsay. You can only deal with what you observe directly. This conversation has no place for subjective opinions and assumptions. It has to be hard facts. Objectivity is absolutely crucial. Now, it's always difficult too because you have to have all your facts lined up, and sometimes people will tell stories with bias. So if you are telling someone about their feedback because you had a conversation in the tea room with someone else and they said, Angela was so inappropriate and so lazy and I had all of these experiences, and you took that at face value because they have a bias. And then you go to Angela and you say, well, you know, someone who I can't mention has given me that feedback. And then they give you their side of events. You don't really know whose story. You don't always have the information at hand. So when you said to the other person, oh, it's terrible that they didn't do all those things and just left you and you had to stay back half an hour because they didn't do their work. And then you go back to Angela and say, Angela, what's that about? So I heard that you didn't do any of your work. And they said, actually, I was in the middle of an arrest. Oh, that's awkward. So it's essential that you are dealing with just what you observe and the objective information. I had a person that I worked with that always used to do that. They would deal with situations and then hear one person's story, mediate, and go to another. And everyone's side of the story is always different. And they would always back out of dealing with that situation by saying, oh, I didn't have all the information at hand. You never will. You're never going to have all the information when you're dealing with subjectives. It undermines your ability to secure an outcome, and jeopardises your relationship with that person. So with our lazy Angela, then we have observed two examples. By way of setting the situation, we started the conversation with maybe one of two ways. And we'd said during yesterday morning's handover or at last week's staff meeting. So you've got two ways of progressing this situation. Now you're setting the tone for the behaviour. During yesterday morning's handover, I noticed that you really didn't know very much about your patients and that you were completely unaware that the doctor had done rounds and put a whole load of orders in their medical record that you didn't act on, that the rest of the team had to act on so that they could deliver that patient's care. Setting that tone. That is very different to saying that you didn't seem to know what was going on and it was vague and you were missing pieces of information and I heard that it was a terrible handover. As opposed to, or perhaps you might say, I heard your handover about bed 10, it wasn't very good. There was talk about it later and everyone thought it was really poor. You can't do that. Hearsay, not really about the behaviour. Whereas when you're delivering facts that you didn't seem to know what was going on with your patient in that you didn't know that the doctor's rounds had been done and that the orders had changed and none of those were carried out. Similarly, if it was perhaps an example about the staff meeting. At the staff meeting on Monday afternoon, I noticed that you weren't aware of any of the new policies and procedures that were emailed out to everyone for discussion. Then when we talked about our pilot program of patient agreement contracts to prevent falls, you seem to have no understanding of knowledge that that trial was even going on. After that, I had a look at your patients and found that none of them had patient agreement contracts for high-risk falls completed. That's a different conversation than saying, at the Monday staff meeting, you were apathetic. Everyone's saying you're lazy, it has to stop. So there are the first two components. We set the scene, set the context, set the scene, and now we deliver what objective evidence that we have to support the behaviour, to support the information we're delivering. Third part's the impact. These are the I statements. This is the so what it means for you, why this is a problem for you. Recently, I've done another webinar that will be available where we looked at, it's called One Nurse's Trash is Another Nurse's Treasure. And it's highly recommended that you watch that one in relation to this because that one reveals that feedback about people is important that you structure it for their core motivator. There are three core motivators for people: achievement, affiliation, and power. So when you're using I statements, when you do this, I feel that, then it's important to be able to structure it so that you hit their core motivator, hit them where it hurts, really. So for the achievement people, it's always all about the patient. So you've got to deliver and structure your sentences around what it means for the patient. They're the clinically excellent ones that really, really are passionate about patient care. For the affiliation motivators, then those people are actually all about the team. They're here for the people and for their mates, for their colleagues. So when you're using I statements and you're going to hit them where it hurts, then you have to base your statements around how it impacts you and the tribe, their colleagues. For the power people, and you're using your I statements, then it's about how it impacts their position in the world and most likely their career opportunities. So let's take some examples. During yesterday morning's handover, when you gave handover about bed 10, I observed you didn't really know what was going on with your patients. Content was vague, you missed critical pieces of information, and you weren't aware about the doctor's rounds. You could structure the I statements in three ways. I found that has a considerable effect on the patient because they missed critical elements of their care today. I believe that this is really impacting the team because they have to pick up your work when you cut corners. Today, other nurses had their own workload and deliver your patient's doctor's orders that you didn't know about or you ignored. Perhaps you might say this. I find it concerning because you and I have talked before about how you want to take a leadership role and more responsibility, and you're really looking forward to applying for that clinical nurse's role that's coming up in 6 months' time. But I can't imagine how that would work when you're role modelling such behaviour. If we take the other example, that at the staff meeting on Monday afternoon, I noticed that you weren't aware of the new policy and procedures and that you didn't know about the pilot program that the nurse manager is running, and you didn't seem to know. So I had a look at your patients and noticed that there was no patient agreement contracts for any of your patients. Statements. I find it frustrating that you're disengaged in this, and they're really great improvements for the patient, and we're really making a difference for preventing falls, but you're not engaged in that. You might say, I find it really frustrating because your teammates have embraced this. We've all embraced it, and your disengagement is making it really hard for us to want to be involved when some of us have to do it and you feel like you don't have to. I find it frustrating because you and I have talked about how you want to take that leadership role, and yet your role modelling is so poor. So they're the three: the situation, behaviour and the impact is how you deliver that. You set the scene, you identify the behaviour, and you express the impact through I statements. So that's one part. That's the structure around it. But there's another part to this. That's always the way that you're going to deliver that information, but sometimes it needs a little bit more preparation than that. And it's worth considering sometimes another model before you get into this situation, behaviour, impact discussion, is maybe spending some time using another model called the Perceptual Positions. This is an incredibly useful tool because it identifies some other perceptions, and it prevents you jumping into a situation before you know all the facts and before you know all of the possibilities in a situation. So what's this model about? It has 5 steps, and it's just about you preparing for this conversation in your own head. It's actually based in neurolinguistic programming, and its premise helps you understand a person's position from their point of view. If you do this, it takes you around 10 minutes. So before you jump into that conversation, that SBI, situation, behaviour, impact, then it's important you take 10 minutes out and think it through. And your first step is identify the situation. Helps you craft that beginning part of the SBI model. And for you, you already know your situation. You've identified that you've got a lazy colleague, and it's important to think through those objective components that we talked about. What objective evidence do you have that they're lazy? You need 3 or 4 dot points and a situation for you to be able to make this an objective conversation. And so we've talked about that. The second step is you need to set up your space. So you've taken 10 minutes out before you've had going to have your SBI conversation, and you need a physical space for you to think this process through, so you can identify what other people's positions might be around this situation. Now for me, if I was in a situation, and I use a ward example, where I had lazy Angela that I really needed to deal with today, that I identified that she's compromising the team, compromising the patient. This is not a conversation that we're going to have in the nurses station, so I might consider a couple of places before I have that. So I might consider the nurse manager's office. I might consider the drug room if I know that no one's going to come into it. But another place might be an empty patient's room, which is probably the most likely that I'm going to have it. So I would take 10 minutes out before I have my SBI conversation, and I would sit in that room alone. In that room, you've got to set up 3 main spaces. Now, this is a concept called Spatial Anchors. It takes a break, physical break, from the way in which you're going to take different perceptual positions from this problem. It's essentially wiping the slate clean or hitting the reset button. But you walk into this empty patient room in a private room and you pick 3 physical spots. Maybe one is the corner of a patient's bed. The second one is a visitor's chair on the left, and the third position is a visitor's chair on the right. No one's coming into this room, it's just you, but there are 3 physical spaces. So you set up your space to do that. Now you get to know each position on your own. You're metaphorically trying on someone's clothes here. You're metaphorically walking in 3 people's shoes. The goal is to get to know each person's metaphorical position and to get inside their heads. Person number 1, or perception number 1, when you're sitting on the patient's bed, is your position. Perception number 2, on visitor chair on the left-hand side of the bed, is lazy Angela. And perception number 3, on the other side of the bed, on the right-hand side, is an objective bystander who has no connection to you, to Angela, to the ward, to the situation. They're just a bystander. When you physically move from seat to seat, you need to also do something that breaks you from that position. Perhaps take a glass of water, check Facebook for a couple of minutes before you mentally move into that next person's spot. And now, as the third step, you explore the corner of the bed and you spend a couple of minutes reviewing your lazy person's behaviour during that handover. You visualise how it happened through your own eyes and consider how you felt in that. The more specific you are at mentally walking through that scenario, the better this will work. Think about the emotional triggers. As you sat there and listened to the way in which Angela delivered that handover, and you physically shut your eyes and you think about the feelings and name the feelings that you felt. You were frustrated, you were irritated. You had that impulse to roll your eyes and think, of course you don't know your patient was seen by the doctor and we've all been working away to catch them up. And that thought of, look at you, that massive chip on your shoulder, like it was everybody else's fault that you didn't do your work. Really feel those emotions. Spend a couple of minutes, then take a drink of water, check your Facebook, 2 or 3 minutes, move on, sit in the chair. Now you're sitting in the chair on the left-hand side. Now you're in your second spatial anchor. Walk through the situation as if you were Angela now. Look at everybody in that room in your mind's eye. Replay and consider what Angela might have felt in that moment. Are there any insights that you can gain from that? Now, it's possible that she realises that she's done the wrong thing and it's exposed in a room full of her colleagues. And she can't do anything about it now. So you feel her embarrassment, and you know in that situation you most probably would overcompensate and try to justify and become quite defensive. You imagine what you would say if you had been caught out like that. And you know you probably would try to downplay the significance of it. You see that what you saw in your first spatial position, in your first spatial anchor, as a massive chip, but now you sit in Angela's chair and you see someone who's embarrassed trying to mitigate their embarrassing situation. You know it doesn't excuse the behaviour, but you do start to feel some empathy about how awkward that few minutes must have been. Spend a couple of minutes doing that. Have a drink of water, check Facebook for a couple of minutes, take a wander to the chair on the other side, sit in that. Now visualise yourself as the objective observer. It's helpful to visualise that handover room from as if you were having a bird's eye view, from the top down, and ask yourself 3 questions. How are these 2 people in this room acting? Are they being fair to each other? And what advice would you give to these people to work out their differences? As you work through that as an independent observer, you realise that you won't have any of the background knowledge. As the independent observer, you only know that they didn't do something today. Angela seems to be embarrassed and everybody seems to be very cold that they didn't do a couple of things. You consider that for a while and realise that perhaps the laziness is new, that it wasn't always like this. Her sloppiness hasn't always been the case, and you make a note to find out whether there's a reason for that. Also, you as an independent advisor, you see a disproportionate reaction. For a missed antibiotic and starting neuro-obs, then everybody seems to have an incredible reaction to that. The temperature in that room massively changes, and you can cut the air with a knife. It doesn't really seem proportionate. And so you think about that for a while. See everybody squirming in that room with irritation, and you see your expression of total irritation. You look back to Angela and see she feels the shame of the things that were missed and immediately move into overcompensation mode. You scan everybody in the room and see people completely disengaged and have no empathy. Their body language changes, handover winds up, everyone moves out, and temperature was cold. You realise it must have been hard for James. So when you say, how are these two people acting, you think, on one side, there's some disproportionate reaction, and for Angela, clearly done the wrong thing, but doesn't seem to be that bad. Are they being fair to each other? Is the reaction that everybody had about that situation fair? And what advice would you give those two people? Maybe to Angela, you might say, maybe take the hit, maybe own it, take some ownership. And the advice for you, you might say, seems a big reaction. Why is that? Explore why you were so irritated. Step 5 is analyse what you've learned. Write down what you've learned. Consider exploring with Angela why that change has happened. Consider how you will move forward and how you will change your approach. So when now you go back to that SBI model and have a little look about the situation, behaviour and impact, then maybe you might change your conversation a little bit. You're still going to sit down and say, Angela, this conversation is going to be uncomfortable, but I need to talk to you about what I observed in handover today. And you're going to explore the behaviour. You're going to say, during that I observed you didn't seem to know what was going on with your patient. The content was vague, you knew missed critical pieces of information, and you weren't aware of that the doctor had done the rounds and that some things hadn't been carried out. Now that, for me, Angela, means that it had a considerable impact on the patient. And then you might say to them, tell me about that. Explore with them. Tell me about what that was. Because I've noticed, Angela, this wasn't always the case. That you haven't always been. Has something changed in your life or in the way in which you want to work here that has meant the difference for the way in which you've changed? Perhaps you might say, I noticed that we were all hard on you. We were all frustrated with you. Did you feel the temperature in that room change? And it's likely that Angela will say, I was so angry and embarrassed and everybody was just so cold. It wasn't that big a deal. I can't miss antibiotics, but the patient got the antibiotics. And your response might be, yes, I understand that. But it comes on the back of this recent change we've seen in you. And there are lots of times that have been like that. And that perhaps the fact that you overcompensated and made it not a big deal, whereas we felt like, God, you don't even care. Gives you the opportunity to explore things in that conversation, and gives her an understanding that you've considered her point of view, and it opens the doors instead of making it adversarial. Now, by way of example from my own life, I've had situations where I could have gone in guns blazing, and had I not undertaken that opportunity to consider someone's perceptual position, then the conversation would have gone very differently. And that's a really, really important part when you're doing this. Don't make assumptions, because there are some things you'll never know about, even undertaking this. You have to probe and seek to understand what information you don't have. A good technique is asking, what are your thoughts about that? Say, I've noticed this for some time now. Not always though. I didn't observe those behaviours with you 3 months ago, Angela. Can you think of a reason why that's changed? So, for example, I had a nurse who worked with me in the operating theatre who was always very dogmatic about how things were run in her operating theatre, but all of a sudden it changed and she became this micromanager and everything was just so over the top. And so if I had said a conversation with her saying, Deb, you're being so rude and obnoxious right now, it's absolutely unbelievably frustrating and I can't stand it, then, and delivered a dressing down for how intolerable that behaviour was, then I would never have been able to explore the fact that recently her husband found out that he had cancer, testicular cancer, and that they were therefore unable to have children. She was going through this horrible, horrible time. Equally, a friend of mine runs a department of doctors, and everyone had come to the director and said, so-and-so's really changed and just not here and skipping and missing critical pieces of information and just not engaged. Had gone guns a-blazing saying, you're putting patients at risk, do your job. Would have missed the fact that he just found out that his father's terminally ill with cancer and only has a couple of weeks to live. There is always things that drive behaviour, challenging behaviours most often. So understanding perceptual positions is important because it will raise questions that you won't know, that you'll give people an opportunity to explore. The third critical part about when you have now set your own scene, you've understood the perceptions, you've got a model to structure this, is watching the way in which you language your information. This is a critical part because there is a way in which you deliver the information that will either A, make it very adversarial, or B, make it very constructive. And a lot of people have heard about this model, that in a conversation, and often in a difficult conversation, and it can be applied to most, we will take one of three roles: the parent, the child, or the adult. The child state is when we go back to feelings and actions that we would have done when we were children. It's not always negative, it's not always behavioural, it's not always challenging, but it's often our creativity or our spontaneity, our wonder about what's the big picture. It's also the home of other actions and feelings like sulking and brooding and pouting and displeasure and sudden anger. The parent state is what we unconsciously play that parental role, the all-knowing, unquestioning, you do as I say, not as I do. If I decree this to be law, then you will just follow it under my roof. We imitate our parents and what they would have done in a situation. So it can be things like criticising, scolding, advising, nurturing and caring. Seems like they're good things, but sometimes they can be very frustrating in this conversation, that I'm being mothered by you. Angela might feel that she's being mothered and doesn't need to be mothered, needs to be understood, needs to be truly heard, but doesn't need mothering, doesn't need a matriarch to tell her what to do, doesn't need a parent to be giving her the dressing down. The adult state is obviously the objective. It's stable, reasonable, able to observe what's going on and make a rational decision. So the transactional analysis is about helping people understand your role and the place and the importance of situations and the target to play the adult role, yourself, and move people out of either the parent or the child. So there are two types of interactions you can have in this situation: complementary transactions, crossed transactions. So the complementary is the adult to the adult, team leader to the RN. Did you give that patient the IVs that were antibiotics that were ordered? Yeah, I saw that the doctor had done the rounds and I gave it 15 minutes ago. Adult to adult. As opposed to what you might say is another complementary one might be child to child in this situation, where a nurse says to her colleague, hey, do you want to quickly clean up and take an hour leave without pay and get a drink across the road? Another nurse says, gold, definitely, let's do it, meet in 5 minutes. That's spontaneity and child to child. Both are behaving in the same mode. So adult to adult is ideal, but sometimes we just do things that are spontaneous and fabulous, and that's okay, that you wouldn't necessarily do. Crossed transactions are something quite different. An adult, a parent to a child, or the adult to the child. Apologies. Did you give this patient their IV antibiotics that were ordered? Child's response. Why are you always checking up on me? I can do my own work, you know. Honestly, what is your problem? The question was reasonable. The team leader's checking to make sure that everything's done, and it wasn't an accusatory question. The response was childlike, defensive. Why are you checking up on me? What are you doing? It was completely crossed. Another example might be the child and the parental response. So if we take our example before, hey, do you want to clean up quickly and take an hour's leave without paying, get a drink across the road? Parental response. You know, you really need to be more responsible. I'm going to talk to our mum about this because this is totally unacceptable. So your mission during your SBI conversation, your situation behaviour and impact is to keep it adult to adult. There is a major risk of giving Angela a dressing down about her laziness, parent to child. That's the benefit of the SBI model, is that it gives you a framework to keep it adult to adult and out of parent to child, but it relies on how you language it. If you start that situation that's not objective, isn't based on a situation that is real, it's just hearsay, then you're immediately going to get into a parent-child. If you focused on behaviour as opposed to just a general feeling about how they're operating, then it's going to become parent to child. If the impact isn't about you and it's your perception of the impact on the patient or others, then it's going to get into parent-child. But when you keep it in that model that we've discussed, so that it is situation that's objective, behaviour that is observed, and the impact that's an I statement, then it will stay adult to adult. So what we've covered today are 3 essential elements. We have talked about how we have a structure so that we can build fences around challenging behaviour. And we've given you an opportunity to maybe walk in someone else's shoes for a moment. It's a fundamental way of doing the preparing work before you go into this conversation. Going through the perceptual positions will ensure that you don't go guns a-blazing and you don't steamroll a situation. It brings balance to a difficult conversation and a difficult situation. And the transactional analysis puts rules around how you language that. It's the sweet spot. This conversation is not going to be child to child, but a major risk of parent to child. And like any teenager, your child in this scenario is going to behave badly when they feel backed into a corner, ambushed, or treated unfairly. So the transactional analysis gives you an opportunity to put structure around how you have this conversation, the approach that you take and the way that you language it. As usual, I've popped some resources on my website and /challenge number 2, so that you can see these tools and these formulas in a little bit more detail and apply them in your situation. A couple of templates that you can fill in and document yourself so that you can structure your perceptual positions, your SBI conversation, and some information about how those crossed transactions, parent to child and child to adult, might look and feel.
Nicole, thank you very much for an exceptionally interesting presentation.
My absolute pleasure.
And for those who are listening, Nicole has some exceptional resources, and certainly Nicole, great webinar and such a lot of information to take in. But some great strategies. So are you happy for people to contact you via the website if they'd like further information, those sorts of things?
Yeah, there's a contact me, and my email address it goes directly to me. So if anyone has any
excellent.
questions that they'd like me to follow up, or one-on-one advice around, how you might handle that situation, happy to receive those emails.
Because I can think of 4,952 times I could have done things better.
And even when you use those sort of three models, it takes practice, because it is an emotional conversation, and people, you do indulge in that. I'm just so annoyed with how could you do that? And then you're, parent-child. So it takes some practice, but at least with a bit of structure, then you get to think about how to deliver that difficult content.
And as you say, and with practice, certainly it's never easy to have the conversation, but with practice you keep your own emotions in check, and far better to be able to work the problem out than have this festering workplace where, there's an elephant in the room but no one's addressing the elephant.
Absolutely. There's a great quote about, when people are all talking and happy and, but there's the elephant in the room, the little things are said, but the big things are left unsaid. But it doesn't make the frustration or those underlying or the undercurrent go away when you just focus on the little things. You've got to be able to say the big things. Otherwise they fester and that elephant in the room takes control. And
this can be applied to all sections of your life.
Yes.
So it's certainly, I understand we're focused professionally on what's happening in the workplace, but the same strategies, you can apply them. So they're fabulous strategies to learn, and I would recommend Nurse Manager HQ to you. Nicole, thank you very much for a great webinar, great content.
Pleasure.
To everyone who's listening, I wish you an absolutely spectacular day, and I look forward to seeing you online at another webinar very soon.